Okay, we ready?
Just check and see if we're on Facebook yet. Looks like we're not quite there, but go ahead and get started. And then it should feed over here any second now.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody to this pre-Passover Seder Zoom Lunch and Learn. So I know everybody's in the middle of preparation, so this probably won't be a full hour-long program, but I wanted to highlight the particular aspects of the Seder that I think are the most important. So last week, I talked about the origins of the Seder, how the rabbis constructed this marvelous ritual for us after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, because the centerpiece of what had been the Passover evening meal was gone, right? With the destruction of the temple, we could no longer have the Passover lamb, and that was the centerpiece of the meal, the focus of what the evening was about. So without the Passover lamb, how do you have a meaningful meal to celebrate? What rituals do you do to replace that centerpiece? There's a big void left behind. And so the rabbis created a structure based again on verses from the Bible and Greco-Roman customs about having big banquets called the symposium. And they took a structure of the symposium meal and elements from the Bible and their commentaries on the Bible, and they created this wonderful structure, which was very meaningful and was obviously very successful, because we continue to do Seders based on that structure for 2,000 years, and we can do it anywhere in the world. We don't need to go to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, and it becomes a very remarkable, very meaningful ceremony for families and friends all over the world for 2,000 years. Today, I want to zoom in on a couple aspects of what we discussed last week that I think are the most important things to know about the Passover Seder. So I'm going to refer to a document which I created, which this is the wrong one. So we're going to go to, oh goodness, what did I do with it? I had it here a moment ago. Okay, 1 second. I'm having trouble with my thing here. Hold it, stop share. We're going to try again. Too many things on my desktop. There we go. Okay, so what are the most important things? We have to, can everybody see the in every generation slide? Is that visible?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, good. So in every generation, that's the message of Passover. And I'm going to talk about 3 things: the obligation for someone to ask a question, then you have to answer that question by telling the story, even if you're the only one at the table. So you even have to tell the story to yourself. And that's how important this is. You're asked to ask yourself a question and answer the question yourself. I don't know what Freud would say about that, but I sometimes talk to myself as well. In any case, you need to do that even if you're alone in your home and there's nobody else there. And the last thing is you need to see yourself in the story. So all 3 of those elements are what I'm going to focus on in the sources we kind of looked at last week, but I'm going to zoom in on Zoom, so to speak, in on those particular aspects. So let's take a look over here. So as we said, the Mishnah says they mix a second cup, and here the son asks the father. That's the essential element. Somebody has to ask a question. Usually the child asks a parent, but anybody at the table can ask a question. And if the child doesn't have a question, doesn't know how to ask a question, the father teaches him, as we learned last week, the formula of the 4 questions. And after you teach them the formula, then the Mishnah goes on to say, and according to the intelligence of the child, the parent teaches him or her. So again, this teaches us that we need to address everybody at the Seder in a particular way that reaches them according to their personality and their abilities and talents and skills. We need to engage everybody where they're at. So how does one tell the story? We begin with the bad part. Usually that would be slavery in Egypt. But we saw last week, somebody said, no, the bad part was even before that when we were idolaters. In any case, you start with some bad part, and then you conclude with the good stuff. We're now free people. We're now monotheists. We worship only one God. And then finally, the Mishnah says you can use the verses from the book of Deuteronomy, which tell the story in 5 verses that begins with a wandering Aramean was my father. So that's the beginning of the story. So based on that information, then what did this? What are the essential elements? How does the Seder continue? So let's go back to the next section there. The Talmud says, our rabbis taught if his son is intelligent, if the child is intelligent, he asks him. But if he's not intelligent, his wife asks him. But if not, he asks himself, right? So if there's only one person at the table, somebody has to ask a question, even if you don't have anybody else there. And I never thought this would be a situation that actually exists, but this year it does. Usually we're used to having big seders with lots of people. Who would have guessed there'd be a situation sometime when there's only one person at the table, and admittedly it's lonely and depressing probably to do it that way. And hopefully if you are alone, you'll zoom into a Seder like ours at Beth Yeshurun or someone else's, so you won't feel so alone. But the Talmud already anticipates the possibility that there may be only one person there. And even if you're the only person at the Seder, you have to ask yourself a question. Ask yourself a question, and then you need to answer the question yourself, right? That's it's just a remarkable thing that the Talmud suggests. So if he's not intelligent, he asks himself, and even 2 scholars who know all the laws of Passover must ask one another, right? Even if you already know the answers, you still need to go through it. Why would you need to do that? And what I'm going to suggest is that what the rabbis are really saying is, this is a story that is so powerful and so meaningful and so paradigmatic. It is emblematic of human life for one thing, but specifically Jewish life for another thing. And that in every generation, there's some aspect of this story that is going to reach you personally in your condition, your situation right now today when you're doing the Seder. That's what they really wanted you to do. That's why it's important to ask yourself. You might think, I've done the Haggadah 40 times already. Why do I need to do it again? But this year, and I think profoundly this year, we realize, you know what? The Haggadah really speaks to us. In our current situation, whatever's happening in our homes right now, it has a message for us. And that's why they wanted you to ask, what does this mean to me today? Right? It's the wicked son, supposedly wicked son, the rebellious son's question, but it's a brilliant question. What does this mean to you today? And, with the situation today, I think there's a lot of different ways we can answer that question. So we need to probe that question and come up with our own answers at our Seder tables tonight. What does this mean? How does this relate to our lives today? So it's not just an event that happened 3,300 years ago. It's an event that we are reliving right now. And that's exactly what I want to show you the rabbis contemplated here in the text. Okay, so even two scholars who know all the laws, they have to ask each other. And then the Mishnah says in the next Mishnah, in every generation, one is obligated to see him or herself as if he or she came out of Egypt. As typical with rabbinic literature, they want to make that statement. They want to drive that statement home. You need to see yourself like you're experiencing the Exodus. But they didn't want to just say it. They want to have a biblical basis for it. And to get a biblical basis for making that statement, they often are playful with the Hebrew text itself, or at least a close reading of the Hebrew text. So look at what it says in Exodus 13:8. And you shall explain to your son on that day. I should mention that this is chapter 13 of Exodus, where it's saying not only tonight, remember the book of Exodus is written at the time of the original Exodus. But then it goes on to say, and we're going to do this ritual every year from now on. Every year at this time, we're going to repeat this ritual. And when you repeat this ritual, even when you're in Israel, generations later, you're going to still be doing this. And you should say to your children, why are we doing this? It's because of what the Lord did for me when I went from Egypt. Well, later generations didn't leave Egypt. Why are they still saying it's what God did for me when I left Egypt? Because every generation should be obligated to see themselves as if they did come out of Egypt. Therefore, we're obligated to give thanks, to praise, to glorify, exalt, extol, honor, bless, and elevate, and acclaim the Lord who did all these miracles for our ancestors and for us. It's not just about what happened back then, it's about what's happening right now. So again, the three elements, you have to ask a question, you have to tell a story, even if it's only to yourself, and you need to see yourself in the story. Okay, so let's look at how this works out in the actual Passover Haggadah. So this is from the Haggadah I'm going to be using tonight for our Zoom Seder. Toward the beginning of the Haggadah, it says, if God had not taken our ancestors out of Egypt, then we would still be enslaved to Pharaoh and our children's children. Now, this may not make logical sense. I mean, it's 3,300 years later, ancient Egypt has been destroyed and replaced by several governments and people since then. But the idea is, maybe we still would be servants to some other, the conquerors or whatever. We would still be back there if God hadn't taken us out. So one way to see ourselves in the story is to remind ourselves that if we had been slaves and God hadn't taken us out, maybe we'd still be servants to other peoples in the world today. Maybe it'd still be happening today. That's one way to think about it. So even if all of us are wise, that's almost a quote from the Mishnah, right? Two wise people still have to ask themselves. Even if we're all discerning and we're all scholars and we already know the story, it's still a mitzvah to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And so the more and the longer one expands and embellishes the story, the more commendable it is. That's exactly what the Mishnah said up here. And even two scholars who know the laws of Passover have to ask each other. And so that's the story there. Okay. Here's the next passage in the Passover Haggadah I'm going to use tonight that emphasizes the same point. Blessed is the one who keeps his promise to Israel. And then they quote a verse from Genesis that referred to the story in Genesis when God tells Abraham, your descendants are going to be enslaved in Egypt, and they're going to be slaves for many generations. But don't worry, I'm going to take them out of Egypt and they will be at last a free people. So God already tells Abraham that this is going to happen. And he promises Abraham that he will take them out of slavery, right? So blessed is the one who keeps his promise, just as he promised Abraham, your people will go free. And then it says, this promise has stood us and our parents in good stead. For not only one enemy has stood against us to annihilate us, But in every generation, enemies have stood over us to annihilate us. Yet the Holy One keeps the promise to save us from their hands. So this is yet a second way to think about how we were slaves and we ourselves were enslaved and now we're free. The first way was to think about, well, if God hadn't taken us out, we would still be slaves. Here's another one. In every generation, the Jewish people faces some trial, some difficulty, some obstacle. For many years here in America, actually, Jews have been doing pretty well relatively. I would say, personally, the major obstacle facing us today is the same obstacle that's facing the entire world, this COVID virus. And so that's the major calamity that we're dealing with today. And it's our firm belief that just as God has helped us to overcome obstacles in the past, God will help us to overcome these obstacles today as well. And so that's another way to see that in every generation, God has a role in helping to redeem us. So in every generation, enemies have stood over us to annihilate us, but God keeps his promise to save us from their hands. And the very next thing in the Passover Haggadah is, well, in the one I'm using, this is, it's a creative Haggadah, so it's added this page. This is a list kind of expanding on the idea that in every generation there's been enemies seeking to annihilate us. The author of this Haggadah has put together a list of all the crazy things that have happened to the Jewish people throughout the centuries, right up until the Holocaust in 1942. He puts the Wannsee Conference, where they agreed to enact the final solution. But before that, there's all these other pogroms and the plagues and Jews expelled from France and England. So every generation, our ancestors have had to deal with these things. And then they celebrated Passover, having faith that God would redeem them again now. And that's yet another way to think about how when we tell the story, we personalize it. It means something to us right now. Now, I just want to show one other thing here. Somebody asked, the wandering Aramean passage in Deuteronomy asked last week, who was that Aramean? Who was my father who was a wandering Aramean who went down to Egypt? So Aram, right, and Aramean comes from Aram. Aram is in Syria, which is north of Israel. So who started out in the north in Syria? The most obvious person, the answer to that question is Abraham. Now, Abraham, as we know, started in Ur. Ur is on the Tigris-Euphrates River out east in what we now call Iraq, right? So he started out in Iraq, and his father, Terah, took the family. They followed along the river going west towards Israel, but they stopped in Syria, in Aram. And that's where they settled. That's where Abraham's father settled the family. And that's the place where God came to Abraham and said, I want you to leave your father's home and go to a land that I'll show you. And he traveled south from Syria down into Israel. So the most obvious answer to the question, who is the wandering Aramean? It was Abraham. He wandered with his family, his father, all the way from Iraq to Syria. And then he wandered further from Syria down into Israel at God's request. The problem is that Abraham went to Egypt, it's true, but only temporarily. He had the conflict with the Pharaoh there. It was in a few lines in Genesis. And then he comes back to Israel. He didn't stay there and become enslaved, right? And that's what the next part of the passage in Deuteronomy says. So it doesn't quite fit Abraham. Jacob is another possibility. Jacob lived in Aram for a period of 20 years. We know that when he had to run away from home because his brother was going to kill him, he traveled up north to visit his uncle, and that's when he married Rachel and Leah, and he had several kids, and that family was still in Aram in Syria. So for 20 years, you could say he was an Aramean, even though he wasn't born there and he didn't stay there. But then he comes down and he does go to Egypt with his children, and that's where they stay and become enslaved. So that's another possibility. But the rabbis had a third possibility. And So they actually, again, they're close readers of the Bible, and they noticed that in the Bible, Lavan is called an Aramean in the book of Genesis, as we're going to see, and Lavan is Jacob's uncle, right? So he lives up in the north. That's where Jacob got his wives and children, but then if it's talking about Laban, he wasn't the wandering Aramean who sojourned down to Egypt. So what they do is they change the verb. I'm just showing you here in the Haggadah where they make this play on words. So what we read in the other Haggadah over here on the right, it's this promise, right, that God kept us, that he told to Abraham, et cetera, that's over on the right. And then we lift the cup. I'm going to put all this together in a minute, but I just want to point out here in the red, you lift your cup of wine, as you say, and it's this promise which has stood by our ancestors and for us, for not once has someone rose to annihilate us, but in every generation someone comes to annihilate us, but the Holy One, blessed be he, saves us from his hand. That we put the cup down. And when I was a kid, I always used to wonder, what the heck are we doing? Lifting up a cup of wine, we don't even drink it, we put it down again. What is this? What kind of a weird ritual is that? So let me just explain that piece of it, and then we're going to go on. Time when we continue in the Western world to celebrate banquets the way they were done in the Greco-Roman world, the most common time we have that kind of a fancy meal is at a wedding. So if you're at a wedding and you're at the banquet for a wedding, the banquet reception for the wedding, when people lift a glass of wine or champagne, what are they doing? They are toasting. They're making a toast. And who do they toast? They make a toast to the bride and the groom, because that's the reason why we're celebrating. We're celebrating because they're getting married. So let's make a toast to the bride and groom. Thank you for, getting it's a wonderful thing. You're getting married. It's so exciting. We're happy to celebrate with you. Here. And then usually we drink it, but then we put the glass down. That comes from the Greco-Roman style, where they used to have quite a bit of wine, and they frequently would make toasts. And frequently the toast would be to the owner of the house, the master of ceremonies, the one who invited everybody to the party, right? Thank you for inviting us. This is such a wonderful meal. We love you very much. Here. He's a jolly good fellow. And then you put it down. Sometimes, of course, in the Greco-Roman world, they believed in many gods. There was actually a god of wine, Bacchus. And so they might make a toast to Bacchus and pour out a little wine as a libation to Bacchus. God forbid Jews don't do that. But in any case, that would be the reason for raising a glass and putting it down again. And in fact, that is precisely the reason that we're raising the glass at the Seder, because we're making a toast, but not to the bride and groom, not to the person who's organizing the Seder, although we should make a toast, especially, in our patriarchal world, which still is not fully egalitarian. Many times the person who does the really hard work is the woman. Hopefully nowadays men help a lot more. But in any case, we ought to be making a toast to the people who worked hard to put on the Seder meal. But this particular toast is a toast to God, because God is the reason we're really celebrating today, because God has kept his promise to keep us alive for centuries and millennia. And that's exactly what this is. That's exactly what it says here. We lift the cup and thank God, because every generation God protects and keeps us. And then we put the cup down. Now we go in a traditional Haggadah. This is a page from a very traditional Haggadah. And the next thing it says is Tsei Ulmad, which I'm going to explain in a minute. It means go and learn what Laban the Aramean intended to do to our father, right? Because Pharaoh decreed destruction only for the males, but Lavan intended to eradicate all. As it said, the Aramean would destroy my father. Wait a minute. That's not what the Bible said, right? You go down to here. Here's the translation of Deuteronomy chapter 5. You will speak and say before the Lord your God, a wandering Aramean was my father, but not destroyed. What did they do? They played with the text. Rabbis love to do this. They played with the text. As you know, the Torah has no vowels in it. It also doesn't have any punctuation marks. And so when you're reading the Torah, you need to know what vowels to put in. And when you put in different vowels, you can change the meaning dramatically. And so what the rabbis did was they said, the Torah doesn't have vowels. Yeah, the normal plain meaning is a wandering Aramean was my father, but we want to make a different kind of a statement. And if we change the vowels of one of the words, we can say something completely different about this. So here you have, they changed Oved. Here in the Hebrew at the bottom of the page, Arami, which means an Aramean, Avi, which means my father, and the key word is the verb, which here is, in the original is Oved, which means wandering. So Aramean, wandering, my father, means my father was a wandering Aramean. The verb to be it doesn't usually need a word, so it's implied. So a wandering Aramean was my father. But if you change the vowels for Oved to Ebed, Ebed doesn't mean wandering, Ebed means destroyed. Now we have an Aramean destroyed my father. Well, we don't have a case where an Aramean actually destroyed the father, so we say an Aramean tried to destroy my father. Okay, so who was the Aramean in that case? Here you have to go back to the story of Genesis. So I said Jacob went up to Aram to live with his uncle, and he gained a lot of property, gained a lot of animals, and he gained 2 wives and 2 concubines and 12 kids. And he realizes that his uncle Lavan, who's been very tricky and crafty, remember he substituted sisters on him the first wedding night, his uncle has been manipulating him to try and get him to stay there and not go back to Israel. And so Jacob realizes he can't leave if his uncle knows about it. So he leaves in the middle of the night. He steals away in the middle of the night, takes all his family and his property and everything, and he just runs off in the middle of the night. And when Laban wakes up the next day and finds out they're gone, he's furious that they left, and he chases after him. But he's not able to catch up with Jacob after one day's journey. And so he goes to sleep after one night, he goes to sleep that night after trying to chase him for a day. And then he has a dream. And so God comes to Lavan the Aramean on verse 24 in a dream by night. And he says to him, "Take heed that you speak not to Jacob, either good or bad." And then Lavan the next day overtook Jacob, and he said to him, "How come you left in the dead of night and you took away my daughters and all your property and you didn't let me say goodbye, and you're so mean?" And then he says in verse 29, it's in my hands to hurt you. Hurt is an euphemism here. I could kill you now. I have more people than you. I'll overwhelm you. I could kill all of you right now. But the God of your father spoke to me last night saying, take heed that you speak not to Jacob, either good or bad. So, all right. So let's find a way to settle this thing, right? So this, according to the rabbis, is Lavan the Aramean. I put it in boldface type. He's called the Aramean in Genesis. He's the Aramean who tried to destroy our ancestor Jacob, but God protected Jacob from Lavan. Now let's go back to the Haggadah, and you'll see how this all fits together. What they did was they knew that the Haggadah said, tell the story of the Exodus using the wandering Aramean in Deuteronomy. But they just told you, as we lifted the cup of wine, in every generation, God comes to hurt us. Somebody comes to hurt us, and God protects us from them. And if you want a specific example of that, we can give you a specific example using the very verses we're going to read anyway about a wandering Aramean. If we just change the verb a little bit, it highlights another example of God saving us, the time when Laban tried to destroy the entire family. Okay? And now I'm going to tell you what Tzei Olmad means. So Tzei Olmad means go and learn, literally, but it's also a term of art, which means it has a very specific meaning in rabbinic literature. And the specific meaning is, I am going to give you a specific example of a general principle that I just stated. I'm going to prove the general principle by giving you a specific example. The general principle is, in every generation someone comes to kill us. And the specific example is, oh, Laban tried to kill us even before we got to Egypt, right? So that's the purpose of Lavan being in the Haggadah. If you ever wondered, I used to wonder, why are we talking about Lavan? We should be talking about the Exodus. But it's to give you an example of how in every generation God protects us. And it's not so clear that that's what it's supposed to be. Number one, because the language of Se'ul Mad is technical language, and you have to know that that's what it means. And number two, the story has been interrupted by lifting the cup and putting it down again. So you don't necessarily connect this paragraph with this paragraph, but they were supposed to be connected. Okay, I hope that kind of makes sense and is clear. Now we go on, just a couple other things in the Haggadah. Once again, we have in every generation in the Haggadah, and here it spells out, in every generation one is obligated to see oneself as one who personally went out from Egypt. Just as it says, you shall tell your child on that day, it is because what God did for me when I came out of Egypt. So this, again, quoting the Mishnah, in every generation, we have to see ourselves as if we came out of Egypt, either literally, imagining what it was like for our ancestors 3,300 years ago to be slaves and impoverished in a hot desert, miserable climate and conditions, circumstances, living in tents. And then we're eating this Passover meal with the blood on the doorposts of our home while the plague of death is passing around all over, terrified of what's going on outside, praying for delivery from God, right? Imagine that you're actually there. Or, as I said, the other way is to see what's going on in the world today. We have, unfortunately, a plague of our own today, and seeing how God's redeeming power is with us even today. But in any case, in every generation, we're obligated to see ourselves in the story. Not only were our ancestors redeemed by the Holy One, but even we were redeemed, either literally today or figuratively, imagining ourselves back then. Just as it says, God took us out from there in order to bring us and give us the land that God swore to our ancestors. So therefore, we owe it to God to give thanks, to praise, sing, honor, and bless and acclaim the one who has done all these wonders for our ancestors, for us throughout the millennia. God took us from slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to festivity, from a thick darkness to a great light. I remember that, from darkness to light, from enslavement to redemption. Let us sing a new song to God. So here I just want to say that in every generation, every year, there's some kind of problem that each one of us confronts. It may be a worldwide thing, like the COVID virus. It may be just a localized thing, like a pogrom in Russia or some other disturbance in society somewhere. Or it could be something that hits our family personally, maybe another kind of an illness or losing a job or having other difficulties in life. Whatever the stresses and problems we have, we are sort of trapped. We sometimes feel trapped and enslaved by them. And every year when we do the Haggadah, it's an opportunity for us to see ourselves in the story, dealing with our own struggles, our own entrapments, our own slavery, whether we've enslaved ourselves or we feel that other people have imposed their will on us unfairly, or some other situation like the COVID virus has imposed it doesn't have a will, but it's a menace on us unfairly. And so in every generation, we need to see ourselves in the story, but we also must recognize the freedom and redemption, the darkness to light. It's just a fact of life, sadly, but it's part of life that there are going to be troubles in life. And it's up to us to persevere, to be creative, to focus our minds. I forgot who it was who said that they can enslave your body, but they can't enslave your mind. It's how we respond to the circumstances around us that determines who we are fundamentally. And so it's about how we can be creative and persevere and be determined and focused, even in times of adversity, that will make the difference in how we survive each of these different things that confront us. Or as I like to say, or not as I like to say, but as a wise poet once said, right, in Leonard Cohen's famous song Anthem in 1992, he said, forget your perfect offering. Life is not perfect. You can't make, sacrifices were supposed to be perfect to God. You'll never get a perfect sacrifice. You'll never have a perfect life. Things are always imperfect. That's part of life. So forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So when you crack your matzah and you're thinking about the troubles we're experiencing, just remember that's how the light gets in. And at the end, we're going to sing hallelujah, praise God for helping us to get through all the time of the experience we're dealing with this year, as he has in past years and as he will in the future. I wish you all a happy, safe, healthy Passover this year. May we be blessed to experience Passover in full houses next year. And may we continue to reach out and connect with each other as best we can in these times through media, through phones, text messages, whatever we can, because together we're stronger. We're stronger together than we are as separate individuals. So God bless you all. May you all be blessed with a happy, safe, healthy Passover. Thank you for joining us.